What's with Robert is a pretty good episode of Everybody Loves Raymond. This is the 12th episode of the 4th season. It's directed by Will Mackenzie, and as always, there will be spoilers from now as I go through the episode and share some thoughts. And it starts off with Amy at the kitchen table with Debra, and she's crying because Robert gave her, for her birthday, a velvet box that didn't have a ring in it. It turns out it had a nice necklace. But basically, Amy is upset because Robert is unwilling to commit, and she starts to think that he might be gay. And that's the theme of the episode. And she actually broke up with him because, well, he's not willing to commit. And in bed that night, Debra and Ray are discussing this, and Debra thinks that Robert just has commitment issues, which, yeah, I think that's pretty obvious. But she also happens to mention the gay theory. And Marie and Frank are having breakfast, Ray goes over, and he doesn't mention Robert initially. But I think this scene is absolutely fantastic. Ray asks Frank, they get onto a discussion, and he asks Frank why he uses the word Nancy. And Frank is his usual self. And we then find out that Marie's second cousin Frida is gay. Marie doesn't have a problem with it at all. Frank was not aware. And then Robert comes in, and honestly, it was a fabulous moment because I was so desperate to see what would happen. And Marie just goes straight over to him and she hugs him and says, "It's fine with me if you're gay, dear." Which is very sweet. It's really lovely. And Marie belts into Somewhere Over the Rainbow at one point, which I rather liked. And obviously Robert is really confused about this, and he keeps saying that he's not gay. And he said, when I'm talking about why he broke up with Amy, he said, maybe she's not the one for me. Or rather, Amy broke up with him. But he said, maybe she's not the one for me. To which Marie responds, is it because she's a woman? Which I have to say just made me laugh. And I love the fact that Marie was being really sweet and supportive, and Frank's just sitting there holding a cold bottle of milk to his head. He really wants this conversation to be over. And quite frankly, so does Robert. And he ends up leaving. And we go to his apartment. And Ray had actually followed him. And Robert doesn't want to let him in until Ray shouts through the door, "I know you're not gay." Obviously, Robert doesn't want his neighbours to overhear, so he lets Ray in. And they actually have quite a nice discussion, and it was very well written. It wasn't particularly funny, but it was a really nice moment, and it lasted a little bit longer than it needed to be perfectly honest. But I do think that the discussion they had was very nice. And then there's a knock at the door, and it's Frank. And this is actually quite sweet, because clearly Frank is there partly to get away from Marie, but also to show his support for Robert, but he doesn't want to talk about it. But he's there with him, and the relief that washed over him when Robert suggested he comes in and they just watch the game, whatever the game is at the time. And Frank is just so relieved, and we have this beautiful scene where Frank's in the middle on the sofa, and Robert and Ray on either side of him, and it's really lovely, and I rather enjoyed it. And just Frank coming over, I think, was a big deal for Frank, a big issue, not easy for him. And I love the fact that Marie was completely supporting Robert. Obviously, I don't like the fact that Frank was really uncomfortable by it, but I don't think it's unrealistic. I think particularly at the time, and somebody of Frank's generation, I think it makes perfect sense why he would behave that way. But the fact that he was then willing to go over to Robert's anyway, I think was really sweet. And definitely a nice way to end that part of the story. Well, the final scene is Ray kissing Debra to confirm to himself that he's not gay, and then he puts the milk bottle against his head. It's a fine ending. I don't mind it. But it's quite interesting that they were able to address the topic of being gay without any of the characters actually being gay. And I thought that was a really interesting angle, and it was really nice to see Marie responding in the way she did. And then ultimately Frank doing what I think is the right thing, the best thing Frank could have done. So it's an interesting episode. I really like it. I think it works really well. Yeah, the scene with Robert and Ray towards the end was a little slow, but again, it was well written and the dialogue was well written, so no issues there. What's with Robert, I think, is a really solid episode. It's a great episode of Everybody Loves Raymond. I think it shows a lot of different perspectives, which is always important, and ultimately is really enjoyable.